Hello, everyone. For me, it's good evening. For some of you, it's good morning. And for some of you, it's late evening. So I want to welcome everyone to the fifth lecture in the Ghetto Fighters House International Virtual Lecture. I would like to thank the Derfner Foundation for supporting this lecture series that makes it possible for us to continue to bring internationally renowned speakers that have graciously agreed to share with our audience their research and their stories relevant to the history of the Holocaust and Holocaust memory. Dekel is a professor of comparative literature and Middle East studies at the CUNY Graduate Center and the City College of New York, where she also directs the Rifkin Center for the Humanities and Arts. She is a recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the Lady Davis Foundation, among others. She is, of course, the author of Tehran Children, and we'll be talking about that book tonight, but she is also the author of two other books, The Universal Jew, Modernity, Masculinity, and the Zionist Moment. I think that's the next book I'll be reading, and the Hebrew monograph, Oedipus in the Kishinev. And since its publication, Tehran Children has been featured in the New York Times, C-SPAN, Journal of Foreign Policy, Jewish Review of Books, The Guardian, the BBC, NPR, and many other venues. And I haven't checked, Michal. I don't know who is here from your family, but I will mention that Michal's family is here. I know you wrote a post on your Facebook page. You're very social media oriented now, that this is your first talk in Israel, virtual talk, really, but I'm very happy that the Ghetto Fighters House is the first platform for a conversation in Israel. And your family is with you here, as if we're sitting in our auditorium and the family has come from all over the country. So we have your mother, Tzipora Dekel, and your brother, Dr. Benjamin Dekel, and your sister, Dr. Sharon Dekel. I hope that your cousin is also here, Gidi Benyamini. I haven't been checking, and his family. Gidi is actually your aunt's son, and your aunt and your father, brother, sister went through this Odyssey together. And there is also your father's cousin, Nomi Arison. I don't know if she joined us tonight. We'll check, but if she's here, we're happy, and her children is Sarit and Tali. And also Aryeh Mikovich. I don't know if he's here with us. We'll check. Hopefully, if he is, he'll let us know in the chat, along with his daughter Sahar. He was a Tehran baby, which is a little different. He was born in Tehran already. So we're very happy about that. And like I said, go to Michal Dekel's webpage to get updates about where she'll be speaking. You mentioned to me before we started that you have the program at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on December 8th, on Tuesday, so you should look for information about that as well. There'll be a day-long seminar around, I guess, migration and other subjects, but your book and your story will be there as well. So that's it. That's my spiel. We're going to start. And we're starting with you, Michal.
Oh, well, first of all, Maden, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. As you said, this is my first talk in Israel, although I'm speaking in English, but nonetheless, it was in a way, I always saw this book as belonging in Israel. And I'm thrilled to announce that the book will come out in Hebrew with Hotzaat Aliyat Gag, which is Books and Attic publishers, hopefully the next few months or, at most a year. But it really, since most Tehran children ended up in Israel, not all, but most, it's, anyway, I am thrilled to be able to speak to this audience. And of course, I'm thrilled to be speaking to such an international audience. I mean, I would have loved to speak to people in person, but on the other hand, I probably wouldn't be speaking to people from South Africa and Australia and the UK.
Uruguay, Buenos Aires.
So there is an advantage to Zoom. Plus, you know, I think this fits very well with my story, which is about resilience and finding ways to get stuff done even when the conditions are difficult. So I'm glad we were able to do this. So thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so we said that we would start actually with your reading a quote, an excerpt from your book. I thought, and you thought together, that that would be the best way to kind of introduce our viewers, our participants to the story within the story. So Michal, we'll start with you and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so let me just say a few words about the book and how it started and then go from there. So the book, its origin goes back to 2007. That's a long time ago. And as Maden introduced me, I'm a professor of literature in New York, and I wasn't really writing anything like this. I wasn't writing my father's memoir, and I was teaching, you know, Wordsworth poetry and stuff like that. And in 2007, I'm in a faculty party in my university, and an Iranian American colleague says to me, "Hey, do you know anything about Jewish children who were in Iran during the war?" And of course I look at him and I say, "Well, yes, you know, my father was in Iran. If you remember, 2007 was the year that the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was in power in Iran, and he was a Holocaust denier. And there was all this talk about Iran's complicity with the Nazis during the war. And Salar had read an article that said in Iran by an Iranian scholar that said, hey, look, we weren't complicit with the Nazis. In fact, we saved Jewish children. So he says to me, do you know anything about Jewish children that were saved in Iran? I said, look, my father was in Iran, but I didn't know a lot more than that, except that my father was called Tehran child and that he was in Iran. And that initial meeting became into this book a decade later. And we can talk a little bit later about why it took a decade to write and so on. So I preface the book by saying that I didn't know why I didn't know anything. I mean, this is, I'll show you. So this is my father, and this is me, baby me. And my father was an Israeli. He was worked for the Israeli Air Force. He was very Israeli to me. He never, ever, ever spoke about his pre-war or wartime experience. So I didn't know anything from him, nothing, really nothing at all, except that he was a Tehran child. And I also didn't know anything because I grew up in Israel in the 70s and 80s. And that was a period where really there was no explicit talk about the Holocaust, almost on the contrary. So I'll just read a little part of a little thing about that, which from the introduction, I write, part of Israel's raison d'etre was to give rise to a child who was a tabula rasa, a child without a painful Jewish past. I was that child. I had no framework for thinking about my father's relationship to Iran or to any other place he had lived in or passed through before becoming an Israeli. I didn't even have a framework for understanding his life in pre-war Poland, where, as I would later discover, his family had lived for 8 generations, a life that had been erased so completely that it seemed not even to have existed in his memory. In nearly every sparse apartment in the quiet neighborhoods of the Mount Carmel of my youth was a life that had been lived elsewhere before the war, a complex story of survival and an entire other family, parents, siblings, sometimes former children and former spouses who had existed before the war. Nobody talked, everything was negated. So in part, this was a personal thing that my father didn't talk, but it was also a cultural thing and a culture that I had been brought up in. And this is why, in part, this was a big revelation and a long journey for me to take to arrive at this point.
I think that the way you start the book, I mean, the name of the book is Tehran Children, Holocaust Refugee Odyssey. We don't expect this introduction actually to be so intimate and so personal, that there's actually 2 journeys going on at the same time, maybe even 3 or more. And what's interesting is that you say on the one hand that you saw your father as an Israeli. Actually, your history as a family starts from Israel. There is no past in Poland, and of course his whole journey through Russia, and we'll talk about that, all the different stops on the way to Tehran and then finally to Palestine. But what's interesting is that you said that growing up as an Israeli was to have a life without a painful Jewish past. And I thought that was so interesting because after you say that, you go straight into this incredible story of when you're only 6 years old. And if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that first conscious encounter with being a second generation daughter to a Holocaust survivor in home.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I should say the book tries to kind of do this impossible thing of, on the one hand, be very intimate and personal, on the other hand, be very scholarly and be based on research. In a lot of my talks, I say that this is a book that gives a historical answer to a psychological question, which is, who was my father? And I think it's a good way to approach these questions, because I think a lot of us kind of wonder who were our parents. And I think in some ways, when I said I grew up without a painful Jewish past, I think many of us of my generation grew up with this. It's like we grew up with the symptoms of survivors without the stories of survivors.
Right.
So we were heirs to behaviors like food hoarding, like, all kinds of very classic survivor symptoms. But at the same time, our parents were Israeli. We were part of Israeli society. Describe it. And in some ways, the book is prefaced. It's kind of how it begins and how it ends with the question of my father's relationship to his mother. And because my grandmother lived with us, and my father and my grandmother were incredibly close, and there seemed to be, as a child, I was jealous of that relationship. He seemed to be more devoted to his mother than to us, although he was very devoted to us as well. But they just seemed to have this sort of bond that was only shared by them. And as a child, I just resented it. And even as an adult, I didn't understand it. And so in part, I go through this 10-year, 400-page journey in order to arrive at a place of understanding that. And that's how the book ends as well. So, I'll just say that, and hopefully people will read it and see more. But I think, I guess what I'm saying is that for those of us who are heirs to the Holocaust and to the war, and even those of us who are not direct heirs, this is not just an intellectual question. And it's something that we inherit unconsciously. It's something that we inherit in our everyday life. And maybe my book is about giving it shape, giving it meaning, so we can deal with it better, not as neurotic symptoms, but as something that we can maybe mourn and move on from.
And what I think is incredible is this really the blend between the intimate and the historical, because you're also, like you write in the book, you're writing a different Holocaust story or a different Holocaust narrative that many people don't know. Maybe they know in different ways or parts. Of course, I know about the Tehran children because I knew one on my own kibbutz, in Kibbutz Yagur, but in general, the story apparently wasn't being told, at least the whole story. The story from Israel and arriving in Palestine is very well known, especially among Israelis, but how do the children how do they become the Tehran children, I think is the incredible story. But before we talk about the Tehran children, I want to start with, again, the personal, with your father's own family. What happens with the outbreak of World War II in 1939? Your father's family makes this incredible, insightful decision And maybe you can share a little bit with us about what happens to the Tetel family in Poland in September 1939.
Yeah, let me, okay, so this is in this photo you can see it's my father who's wearing his tar boot school uniform. My aunt Regina, as she was known then, now Rivka, and my grandparents behind Ruchela and Zindel. This is Ostromozowiecka. It's a town located in between Bialystok and Warsaw. And they, like many people, they know that they know what is happening. They know that the Wehrmacht is approaching, and they basically decide to flee. So this is to flee to their Soviet border. And this was a very hard decision. I interviewed many people, and people said to me, my parents couldn't decide whether to flee or not. We would go to the forest and we would come back, because of course to flee was to become a refugee. To flee was to be a wanderer in the world. And they were very, very established. They were 8 generations in their city. They were very wealthy. They basically get onto, they owned a brewery. They get onto, what did I do now? Okay, they owned a brewery, and they get on 2 brewery trucks, pack them up with stuff, and flee towards the Soviet border, which is very nearby. As we know, Poland was invaded by first the Wehrmacht and then the Red Army, and they had an agreement ahead of time how to separate Poland. And so we have by October 1939, I'll show you, Poland is partitioned, and 1.5 million Jews, Polish Jews, and many, of course, non-Jewish Polish citizens live on this side. So they now live within the Soviet borders. And that's a lot. So we have about 3.5 million Polish Jews before the war, and 1.5 million live in this area. And that's the first leg that I described in my book, basically them fleeing there, and then stuff happens from there. This is the map, and one of the things that Meden and I have been talking about, and everybody talks about, and people write me about this. So they're like, "Oh, we can't believe this map," because if you look at the distances that they will endure, of the journey they will endure, it's unfathomable. So they are basically at this point they're going from here, from Ostrov to like the Bialystok Semyatice area, just across the border. One of the problems with this, not the problems, one of the challenges of this journey was that really, even though there are books and memoirs and so on, but ultimately, when you discover that your father went through this, you're really not sure even what kind of questions you're there to ask. In other words, right. It's not a well-known story. If you discover, if your father never spoke to you about his past, but you discover that he was in Auschwitz, God forbid, you know what Auschwitz means. You read Primo Levi, you read Elie Wiesel, you read Art Spiegelman. And so you maybe would have to find out the details, but you wouldn't have to, in a way, define to yourself what the framework that you were looking for. And I really didn't have that, and many people didn't have that. I mean, one of the wonderful things with this book that so many people write me, and people say to me, people write me and they say, "Oh, my father was in Uzbekistan. I thought he was the only one." I should tell you that there are about 250,000 refugees in Uzbekistan. So, but in this, people think their parent is the only one, in part because there was no story. So I started in a way like that. And I turned to, I would say, in every place that I researched, I had a collaborator who from the
exactly.
Whether it's my colleague Salar, who was Salar Abda, who was the Iranian American colleague who researched for me in Iran. And of course I couldn't, I'm an Israeli citizen, so I couldn't go to Iran, or I guess I could go because I have an American citizenship, but I don't know what would happen to me there. So he researched for me there, and in other places I had other collaborators, but these are hard places to research. It's not, you're not traveling to Western Europe. You travel, Uzbekistan in 2013 and even now is a dictatorship. And when you go there and you're researching, people don't talk to you. People say, I mean, at the time my son was, you know, I don't know, 10 or something. And I tell him, you know, Uzbekistan is like a Star Wars. You go there, it's like the Jedi who go to a planet where everybody says, everything is great, everything is wonderful. Everything has always been great. Nobody tells you anything. So I had to find clandestine research assistants sometimes, sometimes not clandestine, but it's also, part of it is almost like a detective novel, right? Detective work. Find sources and to find somebody who can get you into the KGB archive in Tashkent or can get information for you. And part of it is an emotional, psychological, and intellectual journey to get, because a lot of times we find out we have information, but we have no way to connect to that information. We don't understand that information, in part because we live in such a different world than they lived in, both in during, I mean, that was a different war. That was a world during the war. There were empires. There were, you know, pre-war Jewish life and pre-war Poland and what it meant is not something that is accessible to us today. In Poland, and I was just listening to another lecture and talking about the fact that in Poland, in pre-war Poland, you could be a Zionist and at the same time a big wanting to really assimilate in Poland at the same time. So these political structures that we can't access, and it took me a long time, both intellectual and psychologically, to understand that. So I would say it's a combination of all of the detective work. I worked in, you know, many archives around the world, and in part because I wanted to tell the story from sort of multiple perspectives, or to understand it. So to look at the Polish sources, to look at the sources in Uzbekistan, in Russia, in Israel, of course, and elsewhere.
Right. And I understand that you had to use your clandestine helpers and researchers and get into different archives, which can be very difficult because you also have to rely on people that you may not know exactly where they are and how they see the story. Every nation has its own narrative, so you also have to go through all of that as well. But you don't only use these archives. I noticed that in the book you rely a lot or use a lot of testimony from the children themselves. There's a lot of resources, not a lot, there are a lot of testimonies that were given. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got to the testimonies, where they are? Are they in one place, in more than one place, dispersed?
Yeah, first of all, one of the best sources that we have are interviews that were done by the Polish government in exile in Jerusalem when the Tehran children arrived here, but also in Iran, actually, also in Tehran and in Jerusalem. The Polish government, for its own purposes, interviewed every Polish citizen, or most Polish citizens who were refugees in these areas. And it kind of had this sort of information kind of propaganda center, and they were questionnaires. But the good thing about testimonies is that they always tell you a story beyond what is asked. So even if the questions are very leading, which they were, you could get other information. So this is a wonderful source. These testimonies most of the testimonies are in the Hoover Institute in Stanford, because that's the Polish government exile archive, which is there. And I can talk about why it's there, but it's take my word now that it's there. My father's testimony. So I spent 2 summers in that archive, reading through stuff and really looking for my father's testimony for months and never found it. And I was really upset by that. And then as I tell this in the story, one day I go to a conference in Boston, and I'm in a panel, I'm just an audience in a panel on children's war testimony. And somebody's sitting there and reading, and he says, as Hanania Tetel says in his testimony, I'm like, what? I jump from my chair. And it turned out, I found out that my father, there were a few testimonies that were given in Yiddish, not in, and they were in an archive called Ginzach Kiddush Hashem in Bnei Brak. where I didn't even know this archive existed beforehand. But it's actually a really interesting archive. And, you know, so within, I don't know, an hour, I wrote to them and they sent me the testimony and I got it. So that's one source. And then I also interviewed people. I interviewed Tehran children themselves. My aunt, as I said, Rivka Binyamini, which, you know, very, very sadly died very recently, and just before the book came out. And I was really hoping she would be there to see it. She was a great source to me, and she would, I could kind of check things off. I also had a very interesting, there was a travel journal that was written by a Tehran child called Emil Landau that his sister gave me. And I interviewed a few Tehran children in Israel. I mean, some of them I knew from my father, some of them people, you know, Israel is a small country. One person sends you to the other. But I also interviewed people in the countries that I traveled to. So I traveled to Poland twice. I traveled to Russia, to Siberia, to those areas where people exiled. I traveled to Uzbekistan, and of course to Israel. And my colleague was in Iran. So I interviewed people in those places, whether they were refugees who ended up staying in those places. And this is something that I write about it in the book. To me, it's a simple insight, but to me, it was a profound insight because, you know, I had thought of my father as, I thought this was kind of the only fate. In other words, I almost had a fantasy that my father was almost airlifted from Poland to Palestine with a stop in Iran, whereby not only was this a 3.5 very, very difficult and treacherous journey, but people stayed in each one of those places. So what was a point of transit for most refugees or many refugees was an end point to many people. So people stayed in Siberia, even when after they were deportations, people stayed in Uzbekistan and in Iran, in India. And so I interviewed some of these people and some eyewitnesses who saw those people, who met those people, and human rights activists who are collecting this information in these countries, who are very brave people, because these are not countries where it's easy to do this stuff and where it's legal to do this stuff. And, you know, I try to create to put the puzzle together.
Right, it is a huge puzzle. So I want to kind of focus now, again, through your family, your father's family's journey. We're talking about the Soviet Union, and that's where they are. And then suddenly their destiny changes. They have to become refugees again. Tell us a little bit about where the family goes next and why. Because from what I understood, they thought your grandfather, your father's father, thought that they were going back into the German area of Poland, and actually they ended up going further and deeper into the Soviet Union. So what actually happened with the family? And they're divided, actually. They don't even stay together now. They're actually starting to split off into different places.
Right. I guess I can't really revert to my PowerPoint, right?
I don't know. We can ask go on any time if it's okay now, if we got rid of the people.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, you can go back. Good. I'm glad they're gone.
So I need, I'll share, I guess I need to share the screen again, right?
You have to share the screen again.
Okay.
Good.
I want to go to the map. Wait, okay. So very quickly, as I said, my family, but this is also the story, you know, my family story is my family story, but this is also a generic story, because I should say that, you know, I set out to write kind of in a way my father's memoir, but I ended up writing a book about 500,000 refugees. So most Polish Jewish survivors survived in this way, survived in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, in Iran, in India, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And so when I say my father's family, I also mean, you know, many other families, really. So as I said before, these refugees, or my father's family, flee to the Soviet border. Some people don't flee there, they just simply live there. If they lived in Bialystok, they fell under Soviet occupation in 1939. a portion of these, and the numbers are very controversial because everybody here has a different, the Poles has a different number, the Russians have a different number, but something like probably about 400,000 are deported to the Soviet interior, in the case of my family, to Arkhangelsk. This is a labor camp in, Arkhangelsk is a city, but there was a labor camp here in the northern part of Russia. So basically, people are arrested for different reasons, mostly because they refuse to take a Soviet passport. They would declare that they want to return to the right. German side of German occupied land. Because of course, I should say the situation in the Soviet Union is very bad. There's a huge refugee crisis and it's terrible. And they don't know, they think maybe it'll be okay on the other side, better. They are told that there'll be a train, you'll be put on the train and you'll go back east, but west, home, but in fact they're taken east and they're taken on a very, very difficult journey. The deportations on these, this is what they reported on. These are like cargo trains. They were called, Solzhenitsyn writes about them in his book and in the Gulag book and calls them red cows. They're like these cargo trains that could go anywhere in the Soviet Union, and they're deported to the Soviet interior, where they have to work, hard labor, cutting down trees in very, very harsh conditions. The Soviets assessed that 25% of the exiles died, whether on the transports or here, and their assessment, it may be even a conservative assessment. Eventually, so they are thinking, we did the horrible thing, we should have stayed on the border. Here we were deported, we'll die here. But as we know, in June 1949, the Wehrmacht invades the Soviet Union and the tables turn. So the Nazis, those people who remained on the border, which is part of their family, so part of their family remained on the border, part of it was exiled. Those who remain on the border are basically killed, or they're ghettoized, and later they're shipped to concentration camps. And the people who are in these labor camps, settlements, are released by Stalin, by a special amnesty, with the idea that the Polish citizens, including Polish Jewish citizens, will fight along the Russians against the Nazis. So the former enemies are now united in order to fight the Germans. And in fact, the bottom line is that they're saved by their deportations, because the Wehrmacht doesn't make it far enough northeast to kill them, right? They're stopped before then. And I have I think like a story that people really like in my book, because I travel to those areas. And those areas are very strange areas. They're still very Soviet. I had plainclothes policemen following me around, and everybody knew who I was. And then I was invited to be interviewed in a radio station. Now, in those areas, almost everybody is a descendant of a deportee. Either the perpetrator, or either the people who are the sort of the guards in these camps, or the deportees themselves, not necessarily Jewish, most of them are not Jewish. So I was interviewed by the granddaughter of a deportee, and she said to me at the end of my interview, she said, "Well, what do you think about Stalin?" And I said, "Well, ironically, in my book, Stalin is the good guy, because it's because of that my parents are, relatively speaking, of course, that my family is saved. And it's better than Treblinka, which is where the rest of the family died." And her answer is, what's Treblinka?
Right.
That was an honest answer.
And it comes up a lot. You talk a lot about how does each country remember or forget this whole saga in Holocaust history, not only about the Jewish refugees, but the Polish refugees in general. Where do you find the memorials? Where do you go? So I found that very intriguing. You really are trying to put together a puzzle, and sometimes the pieces just don't exist, and you have to put them together yourself. At some point, once again, your father and sister and parents make a decision to move on. And at some point, the parents decide, well, we have to let the children go on their own. Can you tell us a little bit about how the children, and of course, they've then become part of this group of like 1,000 children, Jewish children, the Tehran children. How does it come about? What actually is happening behind the scenes to actually get to a point where his parents decide, okay, we're going to let them go ahead and we're going to stay behind?
Right. So after their release from the settlements in Arkhangelsk, they continue on to Uzbekistan, first Kazakhstan and then Uzbekistan. And this is most refugees follow this route. As I said, some stay there, but many. And this was a kind of second deportation in a way. This was the Soviet Union, so it's not like you could decide, no, now I'm going to go to
right,
Leningrad or something, but they weren't sent there by trains. They got there alone, and the conditions.
They're pretty much left without anything, right? They're not given money. They're not given clothes. They're not given food. They literally are on their own at this point.
They were left without anything. And as I say, one of the ways in which they survived in the labor settlements is that their relatives who were on the border, who were a little bit better off, were sending them food, were sending them beer bottles with which they could bribe the commander and so on. But now these people are basically, I mean, they don't know this yet, but these people are basically gone or will be gone. But anyway, they have no way to. They're not going to be sending them anything else. So so yes, they have nothing. They're released from the camps without anything. And there is, I was reading into the papers of the ambassador of the Polish government in exile to the Soviet Union, Kot, who is also basic for all intents and purposes, that's their government at the moment. And he is saying, well, you're releasing these people, but they'll just for them to die, basically, because they'll die on the trains and they'll die on, and they do. And many, many, many people die simply from starvation. This is a refugee situation. I mean, people have maybe they'll have a little thing to barter. Maybe they kept something and they're constantly trying to get food. Now, my story is also a story of aid, of refugee aid, and and so as they're there, the people, American Jewish organizations, the Joint Distribution Commission, the Yishuv, the government, the Jewish quasi-government in Palestine in 1940, they know that they're there and they know that this is happening, and they're trying to look for ways to help them. And this, this is I found this very moving in the way that they're just doing everything to try to find very ingenious ways to help them. Because again, they're in the Soviet Union. It's not that you can just send a plane and send food. But eventually they do manage to send some aid that keeps some people alive. But the situation in Uzbekistan when they get there is actually worse than the labor settlements, because there is no source of food, basically. Central Asia is the home front. They're called the home front of the Red Army, which means that they are producing the food products and their dressing, the Red Army. And there was, I think, the Soviet government basically decides that they're going to be, that'll be their role. And if their civil population dies, it dies. And right. So, of course, in a situation like this, the local Uzbeks and Tajiks know how to hide food in some, cellar or whatnot, but the refugees are at the bottom of the food chain. So there's a terrible, terrible refugee crisis, especially in Uzbekistan, a little bit less so in Kazakhstan. And there are these minute differences can save lives, right?
Right.
And when there's a chance of sending the children away with the Polish government in exile, the Anders army, which is, I don't want to get, there's so many details. I think it's very,
and they were actually, the parents his parents already put them in an orphanage. So they were already in a situation where they felt like they couldn't take care of the children enough. And these orphanages are starting to pop up for the Polish and then Polish Jewish children and together. So they're already starting this process. I know it's very detailed. So continue. So they now.
That's right. So they put them in the
Anders.
They end up in Samarkand after various stations, you know, the city in Uzbekistan. They cannot feed them. They put them in a Polish orphanage. So the Polish government in exile is forming these orphanages all over Central Asia, which is a way to again feed the children, right? They are put in this orphanage, and this is again many Jewish and Christian children are in these orphanages, and so they're orphanages, but they actually have parents. Their parents are alive, and in their case, they go to the orphanage in the morning, and then they sneak out at night, and they try to bring their parents some food and so on. Mm-hmm. And from there, the Polish army in exile, the Anders army, which is an army formed out of the refugees in the Soviet Union. When there is a decision that army will evacuate to Iran, there is a chance to take some Jewish children out with this army. So for the most part, the only Jewish adults who were able to evacuate with the army were Jewish soldiers of the Anders army. So soldiers were allowed to take their families. So Jewish soldiers of the Anders army and their families could evacuate. Other than that, Polish Jews, for the most part, could not leave the Soviet Union for various reasons. And it's not one reason. But these children were allowed to leave. And the people who I actually haven't found the exact person who negotiated this. But I know it was basically American aid organizations and the Jewish government in Palestine were negotiating with the Polish government in London to arrange for these children to be evacuated.
So at this point, we already have a group in Palestine. You write about Soleh Boneh, but they sneak in people who are involved with Aliyah Bet. So we actually have at this point a worldwide network trying to track these children and make sure that they end up in Palestine in the end. It already starts before they arrive in Iran, from what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they knew for sure. I think that was the hope. That was certainly the hope. I don't know that they knew for sure that they would end up in Palestine. I think the imperative was to get them out of this hell. I mean, I'll show you. These are some these are some children in Iran after their arrival in Iran. This is what they look like. Not all of them, but some of them. I mean, they really look like Holocaust survivors that we see and the famous photos that we see from 1945. They are they were all ill in one way or another, whether it's just eye illnesses, that trachoma, or they have malaria and they have typhus and they have some of them, they're in very bad shape. So I think the imperative is to save the children. But at the same time, this was not an easy decision because some people said, our children's fate will be our fate. Our fate will be our children's fate, and we're not going to separate from them. In some cases, the children try to leave without their parents' permission. In some cases, I interviewed people and they would say, I didn't want to leave my parents, but my parents said, you have to do it in order to save your brother or your sister. And I think this is also very much a sibling story. Right. I really see it that way because I think it was hard to go through this on your own. And many times siblings helped each other and siblings became the substitution for the family. But I do think that the separation from the parents was an incredibly formative moment. And this was, apropos how we started our discussion, my father's relationship to his mother and so on, because many of these children would never see their parents again. Maybe many of these children would see their parents only after, like in the case of my father, after 7 years, they would already be adult. So there was, it's a kind of formative moment that I think never, for many of them, never really gets resolved.
So now we're on our way to Iran, and I think with the time that we have left, just a little bit about the experience there. In the end, after traveling for thousands and thousands of miles or kilometers, they're called the Tehran children. So what is the experience there once they arrive in Iran? Who receives them? Who's waiting for them?
I mean, they arrive initially, they arrive together. Let me go back to, so this is actually one of the ships carrying the refugees. They're traveling from Turkmenistan to Bandar Pahlavi, which is a port town in northern Iran. So you can see what it looks like and how crowded it is. And basically these children are embedded within this larger constituency of Christian Polish refugees. So they're not organized in any specific way. But on port, we already have some clandestine representatives of the Jewish Agency of Palestine, which was the kind of government of the Yishuv at the time. And very quickly, they are taken to, basically there's the Jewish, most of them, and again, not all of them, the Polish Jewish children are separated off from the Christian children. And this, what you see here, these few tents and the structures becomes known as the Children's Home of Tehran, the Jewish Children's Home of Tehran. And they have counselors. The counselors are also from among the refugees. They're mostly members of Shomer HaTzair, not only, but mostly the socialist Zionist youth movement. So basically there are 20-year-olds who were members of the Zionist movements in Poland, and now they're here and they're starting basically to give these children a new identity in a way and sort of train them to an eventual evacuation to Palestine. But there are also, there are a lot of Jewish refugees in Iran. I mean, there are stowaways. There are people who had these fictitious marriages to Anders Army soldiers. There are, of course, the Anders Army soldiers and their families. I mean, you mentioned Alya Mintkevich before, who I hope is here, and his father was an Anders Army soldier. So his story is a little bit different in the sense that he's with his mother in Iran. And we have gradually the people from Mossad Aliyah Bet make it to here. This is another group photo from Iran. This is my father right here with the hair, which I'm really pleased about. He's the fifth from the right. And these are some Solel Boneh members in Iran. So Solel Boneh was the construction brigade, Jewish construction brigade in Palestine. Iran, which at this point was controlled by the British, was mostly, I mean, the British were in Iran because they wanted Iranian oil to help to use in the war effort. They needed engineers and construction people to work for the Anglo-Iranian oil company. And basically Churchill said, who are we going to bring? Let's bring the Jews from Palestine. So they brought in members of Solel Boneh. And many of these, or not all, but maybe half of them were doubled as sort of secret agents of the Yishuv, and were helping these kids and working on evacuating them. And then there are other characters who get involved. Tzipora Shartok, the wife of Moshe Sharet, and even Eleanor Roosevelt at some point. So there are a lot of personalities involved. And you're right that this is in some ways a global rescue effort. And when people often ask me, who is the hero of your story? And I say, the hero of my story is collaboration and pragmatism. And I think that's what really enables this ultimately.
So how long are they in Iran in the end? There are different amounts of time. There are different ships that are leaving, or is there just one big exodus of the children together?
There are different amounts. I mean, most of the children, and first of all, from the Soviet Union to Iran, there were two main transports in March 1942 and in August 1942. And my father and most of the children who came from these orphanages came in the August transport. And then, so they stay there for about 4 months. But other kids stay there. There's another transport in August 1943. And also there are people who never leave Iran. So again, apropos my first point, I mean, I interview, people have contacted me and they said the people who remained in Iran, I want to show you, like this guy here.
Mm-hmm.
Is I mean, his mother was a Polish Jew, and his father was an Iranian, and basically the mother married the father. They remained in Iran, and they're still in Iran. Most of them left in 1979 or before that, but and then some sporadic people left afterwards. So, but the main evacuation, and this is when it was in at the beginning of 1943, and then it took some time for them to get to Palestine. They went to
India. So the final leg of the story really is coming to Palestine. And can you tell us a little bit about who is organizing things from the Palestinian side, or the Eretz Israel, I guess I could say, side? How are the children transported? I know that there's difficulty that we know even today of how to get the children to Palestine from Iran. It's seemingly a border almost, but in the end, there's difficulty. So how do they actually make that last leg of the journey, which is probably one of the longest, to Palestine?
Right. I mean, I don't know can you see my cursor or not?
I see your cursor. So
if you look at Iran, if you look at Tehran and Tel Aviv are very, very close, very close. I mean, I think it's a 48-hour drive or something like that. So, so they're here. This is Tehran, and they have to get here. But the problem is in the middle is Iraq, and the Iraqi government says we are not going to let Jewish children travel to Palestine on our land. I mean, we have to remember this is in the midst of the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine. The Iraqi government, even if it wanted to, and I think it actually wanted to, but it couldn't publicly do that. I mean, possibly this could have been done clandestinely, but the Yishuv was doing this publicly. And here we have the intervention of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt leans on the Iraqi prime minister and says to him, this is a humanitarian case, these are children. And he says, we're very sorry for these children, and we will be happy to keep them in Iraq if you pay for their welfare, but we're not gonna let them pass. So they end up having to go by ship through the Persian Gulf, through the Indian Ocean. This is an incredibly dangerous journey because there are German sea mines here, and they're being bombed. And I mean, they could have very well not made it. And then through the Suez Canal and into traveling through Egypt into Palestine. And this is the part that we know. So we know these photos, and there is actually, we don't have time, but if you search on YouTube, Tehran children arriving to Atlit, you'll see there's a video of this. I mean, this was a huge moment in the lives of, not only of the lives of the children, because the children, I think many of them were very traumatized. And I mean, I think they were happy, but they were also had been refugees for 3.5 years. And, but the Yishuv, this was, in many ways, you know, when you read the memoirs of people like Lova Eliav, Israeli politicians, they write about this. They say this was a formative moment for us. This is when we knew the purpose of the Jewish state. And you can't see this, but our people were standing holding signs that said, this is why we need a Jewish state. So there's a feeling like, you know, this is the big rescue of these children. So this was the first big, there were other groups, other smaller groups. I mean, there were some children who came from India before and other places, but this is a big group that's coming in, and there was a lot of excitement.
And where are the children sent? You talk a little bit about that as well. This is actually a big part of the book, and we don't have time. That's why we all need to read the book. But where are the children sent? And meanwhile, Hanan and his sister, what about their parents? Are they in contact with them? I know that there are relief packages and there are letters being sent back and forth. How much communication is there? And where does Hanan end up with his sister?
Yeah, so there is communication, and they write letters that are delivered through the Polish Red Cross and later directly. The parents remain in Uzbekistan, and they remained in Uzbekistan for the duration of the war. After the war, and this is the story of, this is most Polish Jewish refugees. So most of them remained in Central Asia. In 1945, at the end of the war, some of them were able to repatriate to Poland. They returned to Poland. Most of them very quickly left Poland after that. And that's kind of its own story, right? Mm-hmm. And they end up, majority of them end up in DP camps, displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. And this was my grandparents' fate as well. My grandfather, who had tuberculosis, unfortunately died in Munich in 1949. So we have to remember that the parents remained, the war ended, but it didn't end for these people. The parents remained refugees for 4 more years. They were refugees for 10 years.
10 years.
So the parents remained there. And in 1949, my grandmother came to what was then Israel. So Israel was already founded and people could come. My father and his sister and a cousin, Nomi Arison, originally called Emma Pelgritz in Poland, who I hope my cousins on that side are here as well. All the 3 of them were sent to En Harod, Kibbutz En Harod, and that's where they were raised, and that's where they remained until, my father left earlier, but the girls stayed there until their early 20s. So Tehran children were divided. The question of where the Tehran children go was a political question. It was a political because people wanted them as loyalists, different parties, because there was money involved, and because it was part of an ideological war. So about half of them went to the kibbutzim, different kibbutzim, and the other half went to. Some of them went to private family. If they had family in Palestine, sometimes they went with
Actually, your father had family in En Harod, right? That was probably
in Harod. He had a relative whom we never met, Rivka, who was there since the 1920s, and she did look after him a little bit. But En Harod took 20 Tehran children, so not just
right.
Most of the other children went to religious institutes of the Mizrahi movement, which is kind of religious Zionists. A few of them went to other religious branches and so on, to religious institutions and so on. And of course, this too was where you were sent, that was the place's fate. So that also determined your life afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah, that's also incredible. Really, place decides your destiny. And if you think about it, every station along the way, and there are many, 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 and like you said, people stayed in certain places. Who knows what was the force that led your family to get to Tehran, your father and his sister and his cousin. We do have 2 questions, but before we go to the questions, I just want to ask one more thing. Because you do deal with migration in how you teach. You teach about migration. How do you put together your work concept of what migration is and what you teach, and what you brought from your research in the 10 years and the book to the classroom now? What kind of insights do you have that you can add to your repertoire as a professor?
Right. I do, so I taught a course called the Historical Memoir, both on graduate and undergraduate level in 2 semesters ago. And especially our undergraduates, I teach at City College, the undergraduates, and almost all of them are minority students. A lot of them are sons and daughters of immigrants. Some of them are themselves immigrants. So this really resonated. And, and for one thing, so for example, this idea that you don't know anything, and you start researching and even starting, so I had them do these projects where they interviewed their parents and grandparents, and that alone was shocking to them, shocking. I mean, one student told me she interviewed her mother, and the mother said she was Dominican. And the mother said, I never really felt at home in America. I've always considered myself an immigrant. And she was like, really? I didn't know that. I thought, so, I mean, in some ways, the fact that we don't know our parents is a very universal trope. But in this case, there's also something very specific as well. So I do bring that in as a model, and I think also so this is a universal story, but I think this is also a kind of Jewish story that a lot of the students can identify with, because it has a kind of Jewish side, but also has a very much bigger universal side.
Yeah, and like you said at the beginning, this is a Jewish story, but it's also within a bigger story of really the largest immigration of not only Polish Jewish refugees, but Polish refugees. And I have to say, one of the things that I learned from your book was that some of the Christian Polish refugees end up in Israel or Palestine as well, which is something that I did not know. So that's something that I want to look into more. So how much do we really know about what place is? It really is something more complex than just, what is my identity? There are many different identities. Thank you so much. Do you want to add something? Yes.
No, I was going to say that yes, what is place, and also how we remember the past ultimately is, it's a personal thing, but it's also a political thing. So if an aspect is not emphasized, like the fact that actually, so most Christian Poles actually continued from Iran to Palestine. That story is hardly told. It's not told by the Poles, and it's not told in Israel. But when you start, like many of these stories, when you know about it, all of a sudden you see that there's so many signs of the Poles who were in Palestine, and they were there for a long time. They were there until 47, until the end of the British mandate. So, so yeah, I think in some ways my book marries all of these sort of national memories together into one plot. So it in a way puts the puzzle, the missing parts together for each one.
Exactly. That's true. I thought that I was going to be reading a micro history, and it's actually a bunch of micro histories that actually create a larger global narrative. So again, I want to thank you, Michal, for this talk. It's incredible. And again, I recommend anyone who has not read the book yet, please go get the book. It's written so well. It really is written as a memoir, but also an Odyssey. It's written as a detective, and also, like you say many times, it's like a travelogue where you had to go and where you couldn't go in order to put these pieces together. There actually is a question here, and we didn't touch upon that enough, about how the refugees were accepted in Iran, the Jewish community of Iran. How did they provide support to the refugees?
Yeah, so the Jewish community of Iran did provide support. First of all, in general, we have to really know that Iran is, for these children, this is the first place that they arrive in that has bread. And even non-Jews, on a kind of spontaneous level, when they get to Pahlavi, when they get to Tehran, people see them on their route. Regular people, that they see them, they start crying because they look so horrible. They bring them candy, and they treat them in a very humane way, which is a very important point, again, because today we think about Iran as kind of Israel's arch enemy, but this was really. Most people have very positive memories, specifically the Jewish community. There are people in Iran who organize, and this is, so there's some kind of an organization that gets formed to help these children, consists of local Iranian Jews as well as other refugees, because there are refugees from Germany, other Jewish refugees, there are Jewish refugees from Iraq, bring them clothing, and they take them to, they arrive in September, and then very quickly is the high holidays in 1942, and some of these children are taken to synagogues in Iran.
Right.
And
that's an amazing story that you write about Yom Kippur and going to the high holidays.
yeah, I mean, it's exactly, and that is that one of the most moving pieces of testimony that I have is from a Polish Jewish rabbi who's describing these children walking into the synagogue in Iran, and how the people are reacting, and again, those synagogues still exist. And let me see if I can maybe share. I don't know if can I share something, or
you can try. Yeah,
I'll show you. So as I told you, my colleague Salar Abda took photos in Iran now. Oh, okay. So this is the.
So
this
now
is
we see the people.
Do you see that? Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the synagogue. This is a synagogue, a part of which was cordoned off to serve the refugees who were, of course, Ashkenazi. So they're European. And I can see. Let me see if I can. Okay. Yeah. So look at this. This is the Torah Ark. It's still there today. This is from now. It says Bet HaKnesset HaYehudim HaEuropim, the synagogue of the European Jews. So this is in Iran today. And this was made available to these and built by actually refugees who came there before them, Jewish refugees or European Jewish refugees. So they do take care of them. And it's one of those things also in Iran where, like everywhere else, that when you have refugees, the refugees are changed by the host community, but the host community is also changed by the refugees. So when you have the refugees coming there, and you also have the Jewish aid organizations that are coming there, and members of Mossad Aliyah Bet coming there, those connections are now being made that change the Jewish Iranian community as well. And in all kinds of ways that are later become beneficial to the state of Israel.
Right, but they also stay behind. Some of the relief, the organizations stay behind in Iran, even after the children are on their way to Palestine, they stay to help the Iranians and the Jewish community there. By the way, Michal, I know that I see that Aryeh is here, and also another child of his mother was a Tehran child, is also visiting us tonight. So they're just saying hi.
This Aaron?
Yeah. Yes. I'm waiting to meet him personally at some point. So they're here as well.
Really, I just want to say, I mean, first of all, it's just part of why this is special is to see children and sometimes in Tehran babies and children here as well. And I do, and in all my talks, people have been showing up, but I wanted to actually extend a special thanks to Aryeh Minskevich and to his daughter Sahal, because one of the reasons why my book is going to come out in Hebrew is because of their generous help in publishing the book. So thank you to Aryeh and Sahal. And it's wonderful, especially to have them involved in the project, because this is not just a kind of sort of random act of philanthropy in a way. This is somebody who is really related to the story, and I hope will contribute to the Hebrew edition as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad that they joined us. It's kind of difficult when everybody's muted to communicate, but I was just checking the list of participants, and so they're here. So I want to say thank you, Toda, again to Michal, for sharing with us a real Odyssey, an Odyssey that was historical, but also another Odyssey that was very personal and intimate, and how you were able to weave this incredible and complex story using both stories together. It really is amazing. Somebody asked, what's the name of the book? So I will say again, and I'll show it. It's beautiful. You have it? Okay, Tehran, Children, a Holocaust Refugee Odyssey. And if you go up in the chat to the beginning, you can see a link to order the book.
Hang on a minute. I'll show the cover. I mean, it is available also if you're in.
Right. We put it up again.
Yeah, if you're in a country where it's hard to when Amazon doesn't deliver something. Then,
yeah.
You know, which sometimes happens. You can also get it as audiobook and as
Kindle.
And ebook and on Kindle and of course on many booksellers. I mean, it is definitely available in many places, and like as I said, it will come out in Hebrew. It's also going to come out in German, and there is I mean, that's going to happen I think within 6 months.
Wow!
So a German publisher has bought it, and it is under review in Poland and may come out in Polish as well. And
that will be very interesting to see it come out in Poland. I hope it does. Maybe it needs to come out in the Polish government in exile and not exactly in Poland. That may be a solution.
I mean, there are plenty of people, you know, it's the book I've gotten actually, I've gotten some not so great feedback from nationalist polls, but I've also gotten very nice feedback from some polls because I also tell the story of Christian Poles, and for many of them also it's something that they didn't know, and this is helping them understand their story. So it's really, the story belongs to a lot of people ultimately.
It does, it really does. And some of them are here. There are more people writing in the chat room that they're also children of. So there definitely is a large group.
That's wonderful.
As well. It is wonderful.
Yeah, I do. I mean, you can follow me by Twitter. You can write me on my website. And if you have documents, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is actually now has a curator who's collecting these documents. Because in part, these documents were not collected as the kind of their own narrative. So if you contacted me and you're willing to share them, then I will put you in touch with the curator, and it'll be wonderful for people to share their documents. I'm finding that a lot of people have stuff that they've never shared, in part because they've had no address to share it.
No address, yeah. That's true. By the way, we also have, and I told you this, we have a large archives about the Tehran children at the Ghetto Fighters House. What I found so far was mostly about their arrival in Palestine and on the way to Palestine in Iran, but there may be more that I don't know about. So there's another contact as well for information. And once again, Michal, thank you so much for your time and for telling the story. I could spend a whole day with you just listening to your experiences and how you tell the story of your father's experiences and following in his footsteps in such a beautiful and delicate way, so that we can follow with you and not, you know, think, no, I don't want to go there. And I think you did it beautifully. So we're going to say good night or good afternoon or good morning. It depends on where you are. And join us again in 2 weeks and follow us.
Thank you for joining us and wherever you are. And thank you again, Madan, for great questions and for organizing this wonderful event.